Login accepted.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me in this final session of the first day, of our first long day. My name is Pieter-Jan. I'm a full-stack Java and AEM developer at Magna BE, a company based in Belgium. I'm also from Belgium, and just to kick things off, who already filled out his timesheet for today? All right, I see you are all fans of filling out timesheets. Additional question, who of you like to postpone filling out timesheet until right before the deadline? All right, so you're my kind of people. So before I get into this talk about automating boring tasks and saving some time and learning something new, let me introduce myself. I have an academic background. I spent over a decade as a tutor at the engineering faculty of the University of Leuven in Belgium. Then I had a very short-lived career in the supply chain industry, and then I joined as a full-stack Java and AEM developer at emagna.com. So this is actually an ideal talk for late on the day. I will cover some things from a helicopter view, and all the technical details are on my website, where you can go over them at your own pace. So what is this talk actually about? After looking back at the different tasks I already automated, I figured out there are actually two criteria that came back. So for instance, on the x-axis, you have the frequency. So how often do you do a task? Is it just once a year, once a month, multiple times a day? And on the on the y-axis, you have the tediousness. So, but I use this term quite loosely. This can mean it's actually a really boring task, like copy and pasting text and just replacing small bits. Or actually really annoying things, like you need some information, but you need to go over several web pages, clicking on links, scrolling down, then maybe copying some information that you really need, and so on and so on. So that was actually what triggered my journey on automating boring tasks. But before I go into details, it's first time for a commercial break of my employer. And my employer is Magna, so they call themselves a full-service global company, which actually means they are all over the world, on all 5 continents. They also have an office here in Poland, in Poznan. And by full service, they actually mean whenever you have a problem, whenever you can find this, maybe you can hire an Magna team. Just to show you that we actually can do almost anything. This is a small selection of our clients. They range over airlines to telcos to suppliers and manufacturers of kitchen appliance. You just name it, and we probably have done a project related to this industry. So let's just dive in. The thing that actually started everything, timesheeting. So back in the day when I was working for a telco, a famous telco in Belgium, we also had to timesheet in the system of this particular telco. So to give you an idea what it looks like, a very old UI, there's no user experience, and you can see it dates back, I think, 15, maybe even 20 years ago. Actually, there were some urban legends going around. Some said it was a very specific, exotic beta version of Fusion with only 2 instances, and one of them was, of course, running at our client. And even the company who created this product wasn't willing to upgrade it because they were really afraid they couldn't get it back up and running. So we were stuck with this, so you can see it's actually quite tedious to fill it out. So what was actually the first thing that came to mind? Just drop in some jQuery. So that's actually just some JavaScript code you can run in the developer console of your favorite browser. So in the actually first part, what we actually did is we added a script tag and we load jQuery. So it's jQuery is loaded. And in the second part, we start by creating just, sorry about that, we just created an array of all the days of the current month that we have to timesheet on. And then we just fill it. And then next part is we go over all these dates. And of course, I don't know about you, but in Belgium, we are not allowed to work on Saturdays and Sundays, so we skip those days and we just fill it out. So luckily, each input field has had this very specific set of attributes, so we could use these to filter them out, and that's where actually jQuery came into play. So we just filled it out. Well, I was very lucky to always have to fill out 8 hours, work on the same project, the same task, and with the same purchase order value. So far, so good. It went quite well for a few months until management made a not so popular decision. As it turns out, some people always timesheeted on the same project. And when they ran the numbers, they went, I think, about 10 times over budget. So to prevent this kind of things, they told to everyone, well, you not only have to timesheet in this old application, you also have to fill out your timesheet or the time you spent in Jira. Okay, so far so good, but that's something I don't like to do, filling out 2 different timesheeting systems. So I started digging around. I already noticed that when you open Jira, that you could query for certain stories or tasks. And I found out they actually had a REST API for that one. And after some fiddling, I found an API call where I actually could fetch all the stories where I logged work on. So Pieter-Jan was my username. And the date of the work logged was after the start of the current month. And I fetched the field's ID and key. So I pulled that in as JSON, and then I reached it with some additional information, such as the PO number I had to sheet on, the full date, and so on and so on. And I dumped all this information in a JSON. So the next step was actually putting this information in the JSON file into this old application. And then I stumbled upon Selenium, what is being used by a lot of testers. So there's actually Selenium. It's actually an API where you can actually control your browser programmatically. So for instance, you can write a statement saying, go to the input field with this XPath or with this attribute. So actually reusing some parts of the code of my jQuery snippet, I was able to actually automate it. So I read the JSON file, and then I just simulate the manual entry using some Python and Selenium. And it actually worked really well. So what did I learn? Well, I refreshed something about my jQuery knowledge. It's been a long time that I worked with that library. Also brushed up on Python that I hadn't worked with since my time at university, and I learned a lot about the Jira query language and Selenium. And what did I save? Well, lots of time and frustration, because while my fellow developers were filling out their timesheets manually, I just walked to the kitchen and got myself a nice cup of hot coffee. So the next set of examples can be categorized as templating. So a common thing that I had to do was actually investigating an API. And of course, I had to use a bearer token that expired quite quickly. But while I was investigating this API, I liked to take notes and some file, figuring out what does this endpoint expect, what comes out, how do I need to use it in my specific application, and so on and so on. But the downside was I also copied the bearer token. So next time I wanted to rerun some query calls, I copied this, and then I got the unauthorized exception, and then it hit me, oh yeah, I had to update the token, but I also had to update all my calls to the API and update this token. And then it suddenly hit me, why not put this bearer token in an environment variable, and then reuse that environment variable in the call I'm doing. So that's actually quite easy. Now I could copy the calls I made from my document containing my notes, just in the shell. And if I came across this authentication error or expired token error, I just fetch a new one, dump it in the environment variable, and I'm good to go. So no more copying and pasting and updating stuff and making mistakes and so on and so on. So it went pretty well. Another example I had to tackle was an application where we had a lot of user roles, and I mean about 20 or something like that. So for creating and developing new features, we actually needed some test users that belonged to each role. So for instance, if you had an admin role, I wanted a user that belonged to that particular role, and so on and so on. So in this particular case, this was stored in two tables. So one, the user table containing credentials of the user, and then a user credential table that provided this particular role to a specific user. So what I actually did was I found out that PowerShell, that I've been working with lately a lot, has this feature called template strings. So you can actually have a string and you have some placeholders in between curly brackets with a zero-based index. So wherever you see, for instance, 0 between curly brackets, that would then be replaced by some value you provide when you want to actually fill out the template. So what does it look like? Well, the first part is actually an array of 5 rows, and I loop over it, and then the $_ sign means the current item you're processing from the array. So in the first iteration, I would feed in the value admin and the SQL template, and wherever you had the 0 in between curly brackets, it would be replaced with the value of admin. So I then got a bunch of SQL query that I just could copy and paste in my SQL editor and was good to go. You would think this is the end of the story, but unfortunately, the roles on each environment I was confronted with was different. So I could not just take this set of query statements and just copy and paste them while connected to each environment. So what I then actually came up with was actually the same template, but now with SQL statements, just using the concat function. It doesn't look that, these are some examples, queries generated with PowerShell, so rather easy. So this is actually the same output, but then with a concat function in SQL. You get the same output, but the upside of this one is that you get the correct set of user roles available for each environment you execute against. Another example is a component in AEM. So I mentioned in the introduction, I'm also an AEM developer. So AEM stands for Adobe Experience Manager, which is actually the content management system bought by Adobe and enhanced in the meantime. And they also work component-based. So for instance, if you have a new component, let's say byline, they have very strict conventions on folder structure, file naming, and what it looks like. So for instance, the name of the folder that contains the component should have the exact same name as the component. So if the name of the component is byline, you need to create a folder byline. So the next convention is the render script containing the markup of your new component should be in a file named name of the component.html. So in this case, it was byline.html. And next to that, it stored all configuration about this component in XML files, which is pretty verbose. And for each component, you could also define a dialog where you could configure your component. For instance, the byline component should use an H1 header or an H2. Maybe the wrapping element should be a div or a span, and so on and so on. And this is then again defined in an XML file in a very specific folder called CQ dialog. Just to give you an idea what you're dealing with. So there's a lot of boilerplate of XML, and actually the only lines that are specific to this component are those 3 lines where you actually say, well, this component has a title of byline, a short description, and the group of components it belongs to. The dialog XML is even worse. So I stripped a lot of XML. So all the attributes has been removed. I only kept the elements, but if you have a look, still 28 lines. And the only useful lines are these here, where you actually define an input field in the dialog, where you, in this case, could add the name of a contributor. So if you would compute the ratio of useful lines, yeah, it's only 40% because you have 4 useful lines of a total of 28. Because this was so tedious, a lot of people just copied an existing component and then renamed the folder and the render script and so on and so on. But this led to a lot of mistakes between quotes, because when you create a pull request, you forget to update some things. Maybe you forgot to update the name of the component and so on and so on. So a lot of mistakes that could have been prevented. And then it hit me. You might also be familiar with this. What I would actually love would be a command, and that asks me some question. Yeah, what is the name of the component? What is the component group? And then bam, it generates the folder and the scripts and the XMLs and so on. And maybe you already know it by the description. I found something, Geoman, and it's actually used by JHipster, and if I'm not mistaken, by Angular as well, to generate new components. So yeah, I checked the documentation, and it seemed quite easy to create custom generators by yourself. So what does it look like? It's actually really easy. I just type IAM:component. So I'm actually saying I want to generate an AM component. It asks me 2 questions. What is the name of the component? And then I type in byline. What's the group the component belongs to? Fill something out. And then, as you can see, it creates all the files and all the folders I need. And the cool thing is, the render script has also some kind of template, and I just put in there, this is the render script of, and then the name of the component, which actually was a real lifesaver. So we learn, again, from all these templating examples. I brushed up my knowledge on Bash and PowerShell. I learned some exotic MySQL function. And it was also my first experience with Node.js, the language that Geoman is written in. And of course, it saved me a lot of time and frustration. So a third example is actually related to Git. So I assume you all work in a team of people with other developers, maybe front-end people, testers, a PO, and so on and so on. So while we work, yeah, new deployments go out, and then it's nice that the other teammates are aware of this, and they actually also have an idea which updates has been updated. So we use Jira with a storyboard and so on and so on. So if you check what has been added and so on, it was quite tedious because you had to go over the board and then maybe copy the story ID and a short description. So again, a lot of pointing and clicking. So I actually found a nice solution. It's only a 5-step solution. So first, we have a habit of adding a version endpoint to our applications. And what we actually added was also the Git hash of the most recent commit that has been deployed. And you can actually do this quite easily with the Git Maven ID plugin. So it generates a properties file with a lot of information, and this is one of those. So what I did was thinking about, how can I get the delta of what's on, for instance, an end environment and what's on my local machine. And I was used to the get log statement, but it was quite verbose, and I got the complete history. But after looking into the documentation, it's actually quite easy to define a range of commits you want to log off. So it's just the hit hash that I retrieved from the version endpoint until head, so the most recent one. And you can also define the format, because I'm not interested in the date. I'm also not interested in the author. I just want the commit message, because we also have this convention where the commit message starts with the story ID and then a short description what the commit is about. So now I have a nice list of story descriptions. So I already mentioned we add the story IDs. So what I had to do is actually filtering out the story IDs that were being mentioned in all the commit messages. And then again, with my newfound knowledge of the Jira API, I was actually able to fetch the nice title description. And then something I came across quite recently, I used pbcopy to just copy the message I compiled to the clipboard. So what does it look like? Well, this is actually the output of a script I ran. So I didn't type this, so I ran the script and then pasted it into Teams. And actually Git got me a nice overview of all the stories that, or updates of stories that have been deployed to int, no duplicates, and yeah, I think it took me about 3 seconds to run this. So can you imagine doing this by hand, going over the Git log history, filtering on the Jira board what these story IDs are about, and so on and so on. So what did I learn? Well, I brushed up a lot of Git comments, PowerShell. I'm a huge fan of PB copy and PB paste, and once again, it saved me a lot of time and frustration, because by the end of the sprint, we do multiple deploys a day. So can you imagine doing this 3 or 4 or even 6 times a day? And then the final one is an experience I had with a personal project of mine, my personal blog. So I'm actually very cheap, so I wanted reliable hosting, but I didn't want to pay for it. So I took advantage of GitHub Pages. So it's actually a special repository in your GitHub profile. It's just your username.github.io, and whatever HTML and CSS you drop in there is being served on username.github.io. So fine by me, but yeah, then again, I'm mostly focused on backend work, so it's not my cup of tea to write HTML and CSS. So yeah, and even I'm lacking design skills, so it would just look ugly. So I actually got some help of a static site generator called Hugo, which is actually perfect for me, because I could write content just in Markdown, and then you just hit the generate button, or you give the generate command, and it generates all the HTML and CSS based on your configuration, where you can just define a theme where someone else did all the hard work of the CSS, and so on and so on. And I was actually really happy with that, but then again, I had to do several steps. So first I had to write new contents and commit it to the Hugo repository. Then I had to run Hugo, so I have the new updated website, and then I had to commit and push this new website to username.github.io. But of course I forget things, so either I forget to push stuff, or I forget to run Hugo, or then again I run Hugo, but I forget to commit and push my new changes to the website. So again, it was an ordeal. At least it was an ordeal to me. So then what I've stumbled upon was actually GitHub Actions. So GitHub offered this kind of pipelines. So anyone with some DevOps experience, well, that will look definitely very familiar. So there are different sections. So the first part is actually, when should this pipeline run? So what I said is, well, whenever I push to the master branch of my Hugo repository, I want you to run this pipeline. And then it's actually very easy. So these GitHub Actions has these different actions you can use. So for instance, the first thing what I did was check out my Hugo repository. Someone else already created a Hugo action, so that generates my website. So I pull that in. I'm defining some version. So everything is now ready to generate my website. You just said, well, I want you to run this command in the container that GitHub will spin up. And then finally, the final step is deploying to GitHub Pages. I spent a lot of time on this, but luckily I found someone who wrote an action. Just some simple configuration stating I want you to push the commits to that GitHub page repository. I want you to push the master branch. And what I really like is the last 2 lines. You can also define your commit message. What I took was the commit message of the latest commit from my Hugo repository, and I appended a rocket because, yeah, why not? So what does it look like? This is an overview of the runs of the pipeline on my Hugo website. So whenever I push something, you see a nice overview with the outcome. So you see a lot of red axes, that's something that went wrong. The green ones are the pipelines that ran successfully. And what does the commit history on my GitHub Pages repository look like? Very similar. Those are the same Git commit messages, with of course a nice rocket, but the dates and the messages are identical to the ones of my Hugo repository. So what did I learn again here? Some bash scripting and also GitHub Action, which is actually a really nice product where you get a lot of things done. And again, it saved me lots of time and lots of frustration. So what is actually the conclusion of this one? So if you ever are in this very same situation as I am, so there's actually the same graph from the introduction, but this time with the different examples also added. So you actually have the two orange bars. Those are actually either tasks that are very frequent, so the vertical bar, or tasks that are very tedious, the horizontal bar. So when you're in either orange zones, then it's a good candidate. But if you are in the top right corner, where those two zones overlap, then actually have the sweet spot, because there are tasks that you do a lot and which are actually annoying as hell. So if you can automate this one, well, then actually set. There's of course the other extreme in the lower left corner. So those are tasks that you do once a while and are actually not annoying at all. So that's something that you will notice yourself if this is actually a good candidate to automate or not. So I actually feel it when I start thinking, shit, do I have to do this again? Then I know, yeah, maybe I should automate this. So as mentioned in the introduction, I left a lot of technical details out of this talk, but I put all references, detailed blog posts on my website. Feel free to go over them, and if you ever come across a task that you automated and you learned something new and you saved a lot of time, feel free to ping me. I'm always curious to hear your adventures and stories about this. That's it for me. I enjoy the beers and the food later, and talk to you later.